9, 8.
You're watching
7,
Experience Comic Culture and Sales.
5,
Streaming live daily to
4,
Facebook, YouTube,
3,
Twitch, and Twitter.
2, 1.
So a few weeks ago, maybe not even quite that long, a retailer went a little viral for saying the inside words out loud. Or maybe not. That's kind of what we're here to figure out today. But it kind of led me to this question of what's our responsibility in terms of the words we say out loud, right? And is it possible that this person who has sort of been vilified since this thing happened, he's been called, comic book guy from The Simpsons in real life. He's kind of been dragged in parts of the community. Is it possible that he was right and we just don't want to admit it? Or is there more to it? Is there a psychological component to this that we need to discuss? And how do those things sort of influence how we feel about the state of the comic industry? We hear a lot of things being said about things. And whether we agree with them or not comes from our own implicit understandings of certain stories, certain creators, certain things. But if those things are untrue, does that make them wrong? Or does that just make them untrue? There's a lot of aspects to this that we could talk about, and we're going to try and keep it broad so we don't go attacking anybody or any of that kind of stuff. But it's an important conversation to have because it changes how we as fans fan. So, without further ado, we should probably get started because we started a little late. And we should get into this because I'm not sure how long I'm going to be able to sit in this chair. So, welcome in, everybody. This is Devil's Advocates.
Hello, everybody.
I thought we were coming back to the video, Jay. I was unprepared for this moment. Here's the video in question.
Most of these new writers don't have the love of comics like these older writers had. And all they care about is, how can I put myself in the book? No, we don't care what you would do if you were Iron Man. We don't care who you are. You're writing Tony Stark. You're not writing yourself in a book. If that's the case, write your own comic with you in it. No one will read it because nobody cares. People are growing up loving Peter Parker, loving Miles Morales, loving all these Captain America. We don't need you to put your input in it. Just write Steve Rogers. Don't write Steve Rogers. What would Steve Rogers be if I was Steve Rogers? That's not how it works. But that's, again, how most of these new people write nowadays. That's why most of the stuff is shit. Because we don't care what you would do, because we don't care about your life whatsoever. Just write a book, get paid for what you do, get paid for what you're supposed to be doing, and make it a good story.
You can see why that went viral.
I'll tell you this much: it's a good clip to watch. I think most people in our community probably watched that and had a reaction to it, no matter what that is. So I think it's good for everybody that may not have seen it the first time around to have that kind of refresher on it or be exposed to it. That is Glenn from the Comic Book Palace YouTube channel, from a comic book shop called the Comic Book Palace in Massachusetts, I believe. And that's just to kind of, give credit where credit due here, regardless of where you fall on this discussion and debate. If you want to go watch the full context of the video later, that's where you should go to check that out.
And I will say there is context to that statement that is left out of that clip.
Absolutely.
And it does reframe the clip in a way. But I don't think it changes the sentiment of the clip, right? It changes how you come to the sentiment, which matters.
Yeah.
So his premise, for anyone who seems unclear, is that current creators don't care about the characters the way other creators do. They just care about getting themselves in a book. And there are aspects of it that we should break down and discuss. So I want to set this up and kind of just get an initial reaction from Bronze here. In the circles that I travel, this has started a lot of debate.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it is about the actual sentiment, and then some of it is about how, as retailers, we should be reacting to it. So let me start with you, Bronze. What is your kind of take on this whole thing?
Yeah, and I will echo that. Similarly, it sparked a lot of debate in the circles that I'm a part of or a member of, and honestly, most of the way I saw people reacting to it had a lot more to do with how it affected, I think, their own perception of comic books today. And I think you watch that, and maybe your own biases that you bring into watching that clip are kind of what you leave with, only exaggerated. So it kind of adds some fuel to some fires, is kind of what I'm thinking for a lot of people. For me personally, when I watched that clip, and I'll tell you because I initially, that's the part I saw. I went out and sought out the context of the video. And before that, I even went out and sought out another episode of the Comic Book Palace show, to kind of make sure that I wasn't completely, judging them off one video. And my initial reaction to that video was more along the lines of, first of all, I don't agree with what he says. That's my initial thought, because I don't read comics today and automatically assume, now there are some exceptions, but I don't automatically assume that writers are putting themselves into the story any more so than ever has happened in the history of comic books, which I think it's always happened to a degree. So I don't think it's been like this polar shift. There's a lot of people that, for example, I know will say that like Tynion seems to kind of insert his character into stories like as himself as a character, but when you talk about it kind of is how you depend on how you mean that, right? Are you inserting yourself as the person, as the character, or the main character of the story, the protagonist, or are you inserting your ideas and your ideals into that story? And I think both of those things happen. I think both of those things have happened for a very long time. In fact, I'll go so far as to say, take comic books out of it. Writers, consciously or subconsciously, often insert themselves into the characters, because guess what? Pretty much all those characters' thoughts and what they say and everything is coming from the writer's mind. So it's very hard to distinguish those two things. So I think it's a little silly on one hand, but I think it was a lightning rod for a lot of people that have issues with comic books and writing today. So I think that's kind of my initial thought on it.
Yeah. So on my side is, I don't know that I entirely disagree with him. I think there are points in it that have some validity. And we could break those down individually later, but I think the big one is that when he says that creators don't care about characters like they used to, he's forgetting two parts of this.
Mm-hmm.
One is that creators have never particularly cared, even though they do. Don't get me wrong. All creators care about the characters, but they've never cared, because that's how work for hire works. But at the same time, there is an amount of care that a creator who creates a character from scratch has for that character that is non-transferable. Stan Lee cared for Spider-Man in a way that no one else who writes Spider-Man can care for Spider-Man, because he created Spider-Man. So he has all of this in the political world. It's called institutional memory, right? I use it all the time when we talk about the experience. The experience has to adapt and change all the time based on what shows we have on the air, what you guys want to see, that kind of stuff. If I hold strong to what I created when we created the experience 3 years ago, and am not willing to adapt, this show doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Right? So institutional memory matters, but it's not all that's there. So I think he's conflating a couple of things there and not acknowledging part of it and and then acknowledging another part. Right? Every creator has always inserted themselves into stories or inserted their thoughts into stories or their feelings or their politics or whatever, because you can't not.
Yeah.
Your life and your influences, your biases bias how you tell a story. I'll tell a story. I'll tell a kind of an interesting story. Maybe not to everybody, but I was with some friends this weekend, and one of them starts telling a story, basically about how she was called old at the grocery store. And she goes into all of these details about what the girl who called her old was wearing. As far as referencing, this is how I dressed in 2004, stuff like this. And then this girl calling her out. And I turn to her husband and go, how do you deal with when she tells stories? Because there was a lot of details there that don't matter. But her implicit bias, her life of worrying about what shoes you were wearing with what pants, influences how she tells the story. Stan Lee, being in a melting pot of people, when he creates the X-Men, creates a melting pot of characters. That's just how it goes, right? So there's levels of this that I think are maybe not incorrect, but maybe not fully fleshed out.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good way to put it. I think especially thinking about the creation of characters like Superman and Captain America, and how the creators of those characters. I mean, there was definitely an insertion of their own personal ideals into those characters, and that's true for many characters, especially passion projects or characters that have had a long established history. And I think that so it's not like the every great lie starts with a kernel of truth. And I'm not saying Glenn is telling a lie here. It's just kind of a metaphor.
Right.
It's one of those things where I think that there is absolutely elements to this that are true. And that's what I was talking about earlier. Like every writer inserts aspects of themselves. But to be clear, like the point he's raising is more about how does it happen incorrectly or negatively now? And I think that's what we'll get into a little bit later in the show.
Right.
So yeah, but that's definitely a reaction that I think is absolutely justifiable.
Yeah, there's the other. So something else that I think is important to remember here is the way the companies used to work. Right. He is basically, this is his make comics great again statement in a way. Right. But he's not considering the way the companies used to work when he thinks about it. Now, when you get a job at Marvel or DC, you work for Marvel or DC. By and large, these guys are signing exclusive contracts. Now, there are people like Tinian, and there are others who don't have those. But a lot of folks are signing exclusive contracts. And a thing called a non-compete exists now. One of my dearest friends is a guy named Arvell Jones. If you don't know Arvell, maybe take a class on the history of comics, because Arvell was part of a very interesting group of creators that went to New York from Detroit and really changed how ground level characters were approached by the Marvel universe. Arvell created Misty Knight, had big roles on Daredevils, Defenders, and drew a ton of Batroc the Leaper stories because Stan liked the way he drew Batroc the Leaper when he worked at Marvel. When he worked at DC, he completely changed the artwork on Black Goliath with Tony Isabella. He completely changed Giant Man. He had huge influence on what happened, or not Giant Man, with Black Lightning, Black Goliath. Some of these DC characters, because as a black artist from a black city in Detroit, he had a better approach to drawing the characters. Arvell tells a story about he would work at Marvel until Stan would get mad at him and fire him. And then he'd walk across the street to DC, and Carmine Infantino would hire him, or Gil Kane would hire him, or whoever was the editor at the time, the art editor at the time, would hire him, and he'd work there until he pissed one of them off and they'd fire him. And then he'd walk back across the street to Marvel and he'd get rehired and he'd work there until they fired him. And then he'd walk back across the street to DC. And that was just how it went. Because these companies were basically across the street from each other in New York. Right? Like, he didn't care about the characters he was working on. He did. But he just wanted to work.
Yeah.
So if Marvel hired him and said, hey, you're drawing giant-sized man thing, okay. No problem. He'd go over to DC and they'd be like, well, now you're going to draw, Blue Beetle. And then he'd get fired from there and he'd go back and he'd be drawing Batroc the Leaper. That's just how these things worked at the time. So these guys cared, but they were still bouncing back and forth and just trying to get work. And to leave that out is to leave out an important part of the history of this business. So in the eras that he's talking about in this video, these guys may have been fans of comics, and they may have even been bigger fans than today's creators. We don't know. But they were doing the same thing and just trying to get work.
Yeah, and to me, there's something about that this is what I think about when I think about that. It's kind of this point I've brought up before where I want to see comics the healthiest they've ever been. You and me, Kyle, we might have different ideas about how we get to that point, but I think we both want to see comics be, their strongest they've ever been would be awesome, right? The only problem is that I think that in order to do that, you have to attract talent. You have to attract talented writers, artists, and comic book creators. And if you want that to happen, everything has to be firing on all cylinders, right? So you have to be able to pay those writers. You have to want them to think that writing comic books is amazing and awesome and a good way to do it instead of writing TV scripts or in addition to writing TV scripts or novels or whatever it is that they're doing. You have to want that talent to see a reason to be in comic books. And I think a lot of things that happen, so for me, this touches on the issue. Oddly enough, this gets to a point where I think about things like writers for the big companies that make these big giant superhero movies not paying their writers and artists who create those characters, because if you gave them a slice of that pie, maybe new people would want to come and write new comic books and create new characters for you that are successful enough to make awesome movies off of and kind of incorporate that multi-layer strategy. That's kind of the thing that I think about. So if you can inject that money in there, you can attract that talent, and then you have better writers in general anyway. It kind of seems like a win-win. If you aren't, then maybe you're going to get kind of lower quality writing, in your opinion, as this person might put it.
Right. So guys, if you have thoughts about this, throw it in the comments. We may not get to your comments right away, but if you see it get starred, it means we're coming back to it. So just go ahead and hit that. Throw stuff in the comments if you have thoughts. I think that, the context that he comes out of in the video is he's talking about Hickman and the X-Men stuff. And he has a comment about how he thinks Hickman might be better as a novelist than a comic book writer. And that may, in fact, be true. But he then goes on to say that modern writers don't care about the characters. And I defy anyone to think that that Jonathan Hickman doesn't care about the X-Men. You don't devote the kind of time in your life that he has devoted to the X-Men purely for a paycheck. Right? You don't build this entire world and bring the X-Men into focus for the first time since Roy Thomas was writing the stupid book. Really, in the kind of focus he's putting on it, if you don't care. You don't see guys like John Romita Jr. leaving companies because they're not letting him draw the characters he wants to draw if you don't care. But at the same time, you have to put food on the table.
Yeah.
So if you're a writer like a David Pepose or a Steve Orlando, you're going to write what book they put you on because your job is to write comics. That's how you put food on your table. So it's an interesting thought about, do they care or don't they care? So let's do this. Let's take a quick break here. real short one here, Jay, and we will come back. And we want to talk about another topic that he kind of mentioned, which is this idea of creators inserting their own voice or their own ideas into the characters. So we will be right back after this quick message.
Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. So as Kyle mentioned before the break, we're going to talk a little bit, and it's kind of what we were talking about right before the break, a little bit about this idea that Glenn raises in that video we saw the clip from, that the creators aren't in love with the characters. They don't have the passion for the characters, is maybe another way to put that. And real fast, though, I just want to address a couple comments that were in here and kind of say hi to a couple of people before we get rolling on that. I did want to say, this comment came up earlier in the show. Michael Patrick Sullivan, utter lack of understanding of how writing works. I think there's some elements of truth to that as far as, we're talking about that idea that writers are going to insert themselves into characters. And by the way, thanks for watching, Michael. We appreciate you being here. And then also Sean kind of talking about that point. I always felt a writer inserts some part of themselves into a character. Now, to what extent varies greatly, obviously. And of course, we have lots of other great people in here. Buddy was in here earlier. Skunk Snot is in here. So we have the greatest username in all of YouTube in here, and I appreciate that. So hi to everybody watching, and Kenneth is here as well. If anybody wants to leave their comments, we'd love to hear what you think about this. Speaking of which, go ahead.
And hi to everybody over on Instagram.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So speaking of which, yeah, so Kyle was talking about a little bit like, with somebody like Hickman, you could make an argument, I suppose, that he's just such a good writer that whatever story, he ends up on Fantastic Four or, now on X-Men and that kind of stuff, that he's just so good. He can just write at that high level. I think I agree with Kyle, though, that it would be almost impossible to write at that level and not have an intense love or interest or affinity, at least for these characters. And I think that I gotta be careful, because I don't want to get to my next point here, but it's kind of dancing around that a little bit. It's kind of this idea of then versus now a little bit when it comes to writing, and maybe some rose-tinted glasses. And I'm just going to kind of tease the next point we're going to talk about a little bit with that. But you think about these characters that are written today, and if you think that they're falling flat, if you think that the writing isn't that good, I think that there's a really good chance that you're not focusing on the stories you're actually enjoying. Like Glenn, I can tell from watching the videos, he reads a lot of comics. He's not one of these guys that doesn't read comics and then gripes about it. He is actually reading this stuff.
I will say, and this is something I put in our notes, right? His understanding and knowledge of especially indie books, and you see it in his videos, and the amount of indie books he recommends to his customers is actually admirable.
Yeah,
because indie books are sometimes incredibly hard to sell, and they're incredibly hard to get people who are Marvel and DC guys interested in.
Yeah,
right. They are incredibly difficult, but every person in this video talks about, they're reading something from AWA. They're reading something from Scout. They're referencing Scotty Young's indie work. They're referencing all of these other creators that are doing these indie books, which makes the whole part of his statement about, if you want to tell your story, make your own book and nobody will buy it because nobody will care. like it kind of makes him sort of counter argue himself, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what a lot of people doing indie books do, is this is the story I want to tell. This is my perspective. This is my voice over here in my indie book. But I'm going to work for Marvel and tell this story over here. So if you're selling them, you can't also disparage the people who are writing them.
Yep.
There's a level there. And so it's this, like I said, this is a guy who's been around for a long time and he knows his stuff. But it's like I said, the other thing I said in our notes is that he's parroting every hot take theater comment on Twitter. Right? Like I equated it to that person, who's, a little bit one side politically, and then they start watching certain channels and get sort of belligerent about it. This is somebody who knows what they're talking about. So where this opinion comes from is an interesting place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I think there's some merit to it too, even if I don't completely agree. And I think we've kind of both said that, we think there's elements of truth to this. And I think to me, it's more the tone of the reaction and the rant that he goes on than the truth of any element of it. It's almost like it comes across in a way as like an accusation or a manifesto, and passion is good. I like passion.
I said it to you earlier. I go, this doesn't come off as authentic. This comes off as showmanship.
A bit. And I think that by the way, there's actually nothing wrong with this because look, Glenn works at a comic book store, right? His job is to sell comics. That's his business. Showmanship is a part of business. As long as you know what you're getting, that's totally fine, in my opinion. Especially if you can be aware of what's going on there. But that's more on the person that's receiving the message, not the one sending it. That's totally fine. But I think there's an element of that going on, and I think that when it comes to that, you have to be a little careful, because there's a whole swath of people that feel that way about comic books right now. And I think that's why this went viral, right? I think this was a lightning rod, like I mentioned earlier, for folks that have gripes with things about the comic zeitgeist right now. And I think that's a huge part of this. But kind of, pivoting back a little bit to the idea of the characters and the writers not caring about the characters, or not being passionate about them, or feeling like their own, I think that you can kind of read between the lines there and say that he's saying that their own perspective is more important than the character's perspective, right? And if that's the case, I would argue that there's probably a little bit of a lack of understanding that traditionally that's been the way it's always been part of, a writer saying, like, I think it would be really cool if this character had this strong core belief. Well, that's coming from the writer. And that's the part that makes me want to kind of disagree, have a strong reaction against what Glenn's saying, even though I think, again, there's things there that are completely true. I think, Kyle, we mostly heard your perspective, I think, already, but is there anything about this that you think we need to still add?
I think you just said something, and it triggered something in my brain. Imagine growing up reading. You're a G.I. Joe guy. Mm-hmm. So we'll just use G.I. Joe as an example. Imagine growing up reading G.I. Joe and having an opinion or a thought or a feeling about the way our military is.
Yeah.
And you become a comic writer because you love comics. And all of a sudden you have an opportunity to write G.I. Joe. And you can put these thoughts that you've had your whole life that are influenced by reading G.I. Joe and Punisher and Strange War Stories or whatever in the mouth of Duke.
Yeah.
How are you not gonna? Right? Unless editorial tells you, hey, you can't say that. That's everything, right? That's the dream on some level.
Yeah.
Is to be able to take a character that you grew up with loving and then tell that character what to say. And then at the same time, use that character to say the things that you feel you need to get off your chest. Like, I think that is a way underrated part of this that's not being discussed enough. That
Well, I mean-
some of these guys do love these characters so much that they've been thinking about this stuff for decades.
Absolutely. And I mean, that example is great because it's not like we have to deconstruct it too much to get to the underlying surface there, which is that, hey, who wrote G.I. Joe? Larry Hama. Do you think he inserted some of his ideas about the military, the characters? Well, I know he did because I've heard him say it in front of me. Like he very, very clearly was heavily creating elements of characters completely based on his own experiences, much more literally than I think we're generally talking about when we talk about this topic. And I think most people will agree that have read the original G.I. Joe run, or even some of the newer stuff that he's written, that was a much better comic than it could have been because of that influence, because of that perspective. So if you don't insert yourself in some cases, you're really doing the story a disservice, doing the characters a disservice.
Yeah.
And I mean, now that was something from the 80s, but obviously that's an example of writers have always been doing that.
Right. I think too, and this takes us kind of to our next point, and I want to sort of hit this, is that there's an idea of when you encounter a book has a huge influence on how you think that book should be.
Yeah.
So, I'll just say it. If you encounter a book in the 80s when it's being written by the people of the 80s, and you grow to love that book, the people who are writing in the 90s are not writing the same book you read. People who are writing in 2000s are not writing the same book you read. Right? It's this idea. Paul, it is more of a general conversation, but we're trying to nitpick a little bit of this statement to come into the more general conversation here in a minute. There's a study that says the music you listened to when you were 10 years old, your favorite band when you were 10 years old will be your favorite band forever. And while I don't know that 100% to be true, it certainly is not untrue, because the bands that I loved when I was 10 years old, if they come on the radio today, I get amped.
Yeah.
I might not pay the most money to go see them, but I get amped. So there's a nostalgia factor. There's a level of, it has more to do with the era that you loved and the way the stories were told in the era rather than the actual characters.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And I think, to that point, I will use myself as an example when it comes to comic books. So my biggest number one love in comic books is X-Men. Speaking of, this will be perfect because we talked about Jonathan Hickman and X-Men earlier. So I started reading X-Men in the early 90s, like many people did. And when I started reading X-Men in the early 90s, at the time, for a kid my age, it wasn't super easy or readily available at all times to just go read the original X-Men stuff. Yes, eventually you could, like Marvel Milestone, and there was a few things like that, right? Trades eventually, of course. But it took me a while to get back to the original X-Men stuff and kind of get caught up on the story. Because I was just like, I had the money to go buy the issue that came out that month, or that, if they were coming twice a month, I had that money to buy that issue, right? And the X-Men series and the Uncanny X-Men series. And, it's just like today, right? You're reading 3 or 4 titles to get caught up on X-Men, and all of a sudden your comic budget's blown for that week or whatever. And so I would eventually go back and read those X-Men stories. And I remember cracking open, the first time I read X-Men 1, I think it was a Marvel Milestone. And I cracked it open and I'm looking at it and I'm reading it and I'm going, wow, this is kind of weird. That was my initial reaction to X-Men. Now, I have a great reverence for what was written then. Of course I do. I have a love for it because of its historical foundation. Do I enjoy reading it as much as I enjoy reading some of the Claremont era stuff, and some of the stuff that came after that I really grew up reading? Not really. It doesn't resonate with me the same way. Now, objectively, everybody in the comic book fan will tell you that's amazing stuff. It's amazing for the time. But because I come from a later time, I can't identify with it in the same way as people that grew up reading it or people that have an affinity for just that period of comics. Same can be said for jumping 20 years forward and reading, 30 years forward and reading X-Men stuff from the same timeline. Like I don't identify with early 2000s X-Men as much as I do that sweet spot in the 90s when I was truly reading comic books. So that's 100% true for at least a large portion of comic book collectors. And so where's the point of that? Where's the significance of it come in? You have people that are only going to be happy or only going to be thrilled or really supporting comic book characters that they grew up loving if they're written the same way that they were back then. And it's just not as likely for that to happen because times change, things change, storytelling techniques change, art techniques change, pacing changes. You go from single issue stories to volume based stories, episodic. There's all kinds of different things that have changed. So how are you going to have the same tone, the same stories, the same villains? There's going to be new villains introduced, new storylines. Characters should evolve over time, right? Like, I mean, you don't want Wolverine to be the exact same guy he was in 1978 forever. You may think you do, but you go back and read some of that stuff, and it takes him a day and a half to heal instead of 5 minutes like he does now. And people prefer that fast-paced Wolverine generally. So things are going to change, right? And I think that's a big part of that.
Right. So we have some of the comments, and I'm going to start at the bottom because this is what we're talking about. Paul says, I don't think anyone should drastically change an established character, though. I like the analogy, put the toy back the way you found it. But I would argue that if you don't, the characters that you love are going to be not available. And here's what I mean. I see you have a Turtles profile picture there, Paul, and I can give a Turtles example. If the Turtles were still being written the way Kevin and Peter wrote them in 1988, they would have very little relevance to today's reader. It would be nothing but a nostalgia trip. Those characters have to change dramatically. And you see in the most successful recent story, The Last Ronin, a dramatic change. Now, do they continue that story out, going forward at some point? I don't know, but you see that dramatic change. The other example I'll give you is characters that exist now that would have been canceled. You couldn't say the things you used to say in Weird War stories, or with a character like Nick Fury, or with a character like the Punisher in today's world. You just can't. Shang-Chi, the book Shang-Chi was so racist when it was coming out back in the 70s and 80s. Couldn't do it now. So these characters have to have a drastic change.
I actually kind of like it.
The original Peacemaker. These things, they couldn't exist now because without the change, their relevance would be gone. Their accessibility would be gone. They would turn off more readers than they create. And so while a portion of the comic book community is turned off by the fact that these things have changed, it's less than would be turned off by the fact that if they hadn't.
Well, and it's something that you and I talked about when we were planning some stuff for this discussion. Think of a character like Batman. Batman has really been, I would argue, 5 or 6 different characters in some ways since his creation, because they've been so different from each other as far as the tone, the origin story. You can say the same thing for Superman. In some ways, it's been very different throughout time. And you take a character like Batman, and I think I can say fairly authoritatively that the popular notion of what Batman is today, if you had never changed that character, if you'd put it back in the toy box exactly the way it was found, it would not be a character that many people would enjoy the same way they enjoy the current Batman, for example,
right.
or their ideal Batman, whichever era that may be from.
Right. So Michael says, I think the worldview and morals have changed over the writers and years and generations, while some readers have not changed their outlook on things in decades. I think that's very true. I think the fact of the matter is that most of the fandom, most of the industry, most of everyone working in comics has moved forward with their thinkings, with their ideas behind storytelling, with their way that they approach these characters as the modern era has moved forward. When Iron Man was created, the idea of building a robot suit like to fix yourself from an injury was like science fiction. Now, like, pacemakers are a thing. And I have a friend who is a wounded veteran who has a suit that he puts on that enables him to walk. Like, it's not so far-fetched. So if we don't move Tony Stark forward from that original Tony Stark, that, you know, that character becomes antiquated. And so these people who have not changed, who want that Tony Stark again, are the people who are being left behind.
Yeah.
You know, I say it all the time. It's not the 90s anymore. We don't have to act like it. There is a segment of the retailer community, and I will speak for the retailer community in this regard, that are behaving now like they did when the bubble burst. They're behaving now like they did in 2008. As well they should, because you have to survive times like this. This is an economic downturn in the comic book industry. You have to do what you have to do to survive.
Yeah.
But you don't have to act like everyone else is to blame, which is what you had to do in the 90s. You don't have to act like, oh, there's a problem at some higher level, Illuminati, publishers, writers, woke, whatever. You can just say, things are slow, things are tough. You don't have to hold your ideas back the way you did back then. So...
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I do have to before we move on, I think this is important to bring up now. Aggressively Relaxing says Lego Batman is where the character really peaked. And you know what? I think you're right. Lego Batman is pretty awesome.
I just watched the Big Bang Theory episode where Adam West comes to Sheldon's birthday and ranks the best Batmans. And it basically is giving me life in this comment. So Nice. All right.
So we did one extra point we wanted to talk about here in regards to this. Do you think it's ready time to move on to that one?
What I want to do first is let you guys know about a couple things, and we're going to take a quick break, and we'll come right back. Real quick, Jay. So Thursday, we have a new show starting at 11 a.m. Eastern here on The Experience. 11 a.m. Eastern here on The Experience. The middle of the night if you're on the West Coast. It is Jam Comics. We were supposed to start last week. We needed to push it off a week. They're starting Wednesday. They'll be joining us Wednesdays at 11 a.m. and Saturdays at 7:30 p.m.
Cool.
Doing vintage comic live sale here on The Experience. So I'm excited for that. Also, in case you haven't heard, we've reached our goal of 2,500 subscribers on YouTube. Now, don't stop hitting subscribe. Don't stop hitting like. Do all those things if you haven't already. I appreciate you when you do it. I really do. But what that means is that 2 weeks from today, starting in the Comic Collectibles show, and we'll have one for ours, we will be giving away 25 either graded comics or incredibly high ratio variants. So, starting 2 weeks from today, we will be doing that here on all the shows on The Experience. And last but not least, we have an app now. Head over to App Store or Google Play and just search The EXP Live to find our app. Do it after the show. Don't go right now. Do it after the show. But, Michael, I don't know. Probably because we don't ask a lot. We're not them kind of guys, but we appreciate the fact that you did, and we would like everybody else to. But, yeah, head over to Google Play and the App Store on iPhone and search the EXP Live. Go ahead and download the app. If you like the app, I know it's basic. Don't get angry at me. I'm not good at this. I had to learn how to program apps. Please give it a review. Give it 5 stars, all the stars. That would be super helpful for us. So,
Kyle built an app in a cave with spare parts, people.
right.
By the way, I will just say this. I went and downloaded the app earlier, and there's actually some pretty cool stuff on there you can go check out now. So I would recommend absolutely going and doing that.
Yeah, there will be more stuff there soon. So Thursday for Jam Comics, Saturday for Jam Comics. Download the app. We will be right back after this incredibly short commercial break.
Imagine being at a convention and going to an interview panel that's just for you. No bustling crowds, no hours-long lines, just you, the moderator, and your favorite comic book creators. Well, this is pretty much that. Miss Jen sits down every week with 2 comic book creators for a live stream interview about their latest work, and you can ask them whatever you want. It's Talking Shop, Mondays at 5 Eastern on The Experience, Comic Culture and Sales.
Welcome back in, everybody. Sean, that's because it's you. Everybody else should be able to see it. So I'm just gonna say I blocked Sean until I figure out why Sean can't see it. Anyway.
Oh, there you go. I mean, that makes sense at least.
Right. We are back here. We are talking about the viral video from a few weeks ago from Glenn at Comics Palace or Comic Book Palace, talking about why he thinks comics aren't selling as well as they are, and kind of going on a rant about how creators don't care, creators are inserting themselves in the comics too much, and that kind of thing. And hey, you came for the troll, you get the troll. And the last thing we kind of want to talk to is this idea that we as fans often try to play the blame game rather than looking at ourselves and kind of saying, you know what, maybe I'm part of the problem, or maybe I need to consider the overall idea here rather than just my own opinions. We try to place the blame on someone or something. I'll never forget, Marvel announced they had spent like $3 million on stories that were going to be coming out for a limited period of time where many of their main characters had become women. Thor was a woman, some of these other things. And the internet jumped up and down, and these books didn't sell. And part of why they didn't sell is that Marvel didn't market them great. But part of why they didn't sell is that Marvel abandoned the plan too early. And so people blamed the lack of sales on, well, you can't make characters girls. Nobody wants to read comics with girls. You know, they tried to place blame on everything other than the fact that if the internet had just shut up and waited for the whole thing to play out, they would have seen where everything was going. Yeah. Right? They could have seen what happened, and it could have been a product that at the end you could have really enjoyed, or could have really gone a long way towards creating new readers, which is a problem we have now, right? We don't have enough new readers, and one of the segments that's wildly underrepresented is women. Well, if the internet jumps up and down and places blame on making things women for why books don't sell, why would they ever create books that bring women into comics? So let me ask you, Brian, have you thought about this? Why we trying to assign blame, or have you ever caught yourself trying to do it?
Yeah, and I think that there's an element of this. I can't get around the element of this this is almost how everything has to work now. If it isn't the biggest thing in the world, if it isn't Taylor Swift at the Super Bowl successful, people will want to figure out, it didn't succeed because of this, that, and the other thing. Never mind the fact that if it is super successful, like Taylor Swift at the Super Bowl, people will find reasons to be mad at it still. And this, this is how anything works now. It's thing is popular and worth discussing in your online community. And I'm using that in a very broad sense because it could be a lot of different things. We're talking about comic books. Mm-hmm. But when something comes out, like a good example right now would be the Ultimate comics are selling really well and highly sought after. Okay. Doesn't matter. There's people that are, oh, that's so stupid. People are only doing that because of speculators. There's people that are saying, oh, that's so cool that a comic book's good story is driving sales. People have reasons they want to attribute blame they want to lay for why something is bad, reasons why they think things are successful. Everything has to be part of an agenda. Everything has to be part of something bigger. It's this kind of reactionary culture that we've created for ourselves online. It drives me sad, is how it really drives me. I get so sad about it whenever it happens. For me, it's knowing that a movie like The Marvels is going to come out, for example. And I finally saw The Marvels, by the way. So not really spoilers for The Marvels, but I'm going to discuss it slightly just for a second. Something like The Marvels coming out. And before the trailer even hits, hearing the, kind of eye-rolling sighs from a segment of the population. Honestly, regardless of what you thought about the movie, The Marvels, I will say the first trailer that hit, I actually thought was one of the best MCU trailers that ever happened. It was set to great music. It had good pacing. Thought it was awesome. Another example would be like Deadpool 3 had a trailer come out yesterday during the Super Bowl, right? Like that's huge news for people. Oh, it's so like it wasn't cool enough. They showed too much in leaks, all these different things, right? So everybody has to react to this stuff. And do I do it too? Yeah, of course I do it. Of course I do it. The difference is for me is I don't tend, even though I get on YouTube and talk about this stuff, even though I have social media, I don't tend to react negatively to things like that so often because first of all, I believe in waiting. I believe in waiting and consuming and digesting the product before speaking on it, right? A trailer for a movie is not going to get me going this, that, or the other thing unless there's something super glaring about it. A comic book series or an arc, I'm going to wait till it's done to talk about it. A movie, I'm going to wait till I watched it to talk about it. I don't understand. Like, there's so many things that we understand that a lot of movies are really popular now that have twists, right? Like M. Night Shyamalan made that really, really popular. And so you can't get all the way up to the end of something and then have that twist happen that kind of reframes the whole movie and have this crazy experience you didn't expect to have. And on one hand, and on the other hand, be bitching about how bad the trailer was before you ever even saw it.
I'm gonna click on this comment and say, Jay, I'll put some respect on its name when the trailer's not less good than the teaser.
Here's the funny thing is I have complicated thoughts on the Super Bowl, folks. It was hard for me to watch a lot of it, and I missed the live airing teaser. And I kept waiting for it. I was surprised I missed it. And so I went and sought out the full trailer on YouTube because I knew it was out, but I was just hoping to see it organically during the game. But I was like, well, they're not showing it again. I must have missed it. And so I didn't realize that there was two different versions that people were talking about. And so I've only seen the full trailer online.
Right.
So
the teaser had me amped. The regular trailer was just like, meh.
It's funny because I've heard the opposite from other people saying the teaser was there in the trailer. It's weird. This is a perfect example.
Right. No, and again, I would rather go see this movie than about 90 other things I'm going to have to go see before then. But just saying, the teaser was what sold it. And then the regular trailer was like, really? You going to tell me all this? Really? Really? Come on.
So after the show, everybody, before you go and download the EXP app, go and check out.
After you download the app.
Oh,
after the app
first. Fine. We should put a link in the app to it. Then we know they have to go. So yeah, but basically the point is that I think that there's just that kind of phenomenon that happens today, and unfortunately, I wish every discussion didn't have to start and stop with that type of reaction, because it to me limits the conversation. You don't get to have the fight. Like, we're having a good conversation. I think we're having a great conversation about the short video excerpt. Granted, we do go and watch the full video, but we're having this conversation in depth about the points that were made and the ramifications of it. It's kind of what we do, but we're not just sitting there going like, oh, it's, the blame game, and this is why. We're saying like, yeah, there's good points, there's bad points, and here's why, and here's the texture. And I think it's kind of limiting to not have those kind of conversations. So I guess and I can only imagine what it's like working in a comic book shop, by the way. That's the other part of this, is I know you're hit with stuff all day long, people's opinions. You have to react to it. I've worked in game stores. I've worked in other places, specialty retail. I've worked in movie theaters where people are talking about the movies and people talking about the games. So I kind of can imagine what it's like. I've been in comic book shops, and I can tell you that probably has an effect on longtime employees / owners of comic book stores after a long time too. So I think that's what we're saying. There's
a level of toxicity that's important to reference. And I said this earlier when we were prepping on the show. I said, something that I like about Glenn a lot is that when you talk to him about a specific character, they're the interactions I love in a comic book store. They're the ones where, we're talking about, 3-finger Usagi Yojimbo versus 5-finger Usagi Yojimbo. Like, very niche conversations that I love. But when Glenn extemporizes in the show, you see some of this toxicity that exists inside comic book stores. And I'm as guilty of it as anybody, because my comic book shop, we experience some of this. But the other interesting thing for me is this idea of that toxicity being given to you. When you own a retail store, and this is something we maybe didn't talk enough about, and where some of my opinions on our LCS health check come from, is that if you want to be successful, you have to almost stomach people coming in and saying things to you that cause you to want to go over the counter and rearrange their organs. Racist, homophobic, sexist, misogynistic, awful, awful things sometimes. And it's hard not to let that soil your soul. Right? It's hard not to let that drag you down. And so I see some of that in this video, and I see some of that in the things he's talking about. And I see some of it in sales. Right? When one of the things I was telling Bronze about is that in the retailer community, this video is still a big topic of conversation, because it's been pivoted into, well, how are such and such books selling because of these creators, or because of these ideas that have been attributed to this book. And I don't want to get into specifics, because it gets political and it gets, all this kind of stuff. But you see it in the fandom, right? When popular influencers, which we talked about last week, come on the internet and tell you something's no good, or when it doesn't hit the Key Collector Hot 10 or the CBSI Hot 20 or whatever the hell, the books don't sell. And why is that? It's not because the stories are bad. It's because somebody told you they weren't good. Right? It's this idea of, and I'm playing the blame game now. So it's hard as a retailer to see these trends happen and not have it affect you. And at the same time, to try to rise above it.
Yeah.
And be like, I know what you heard, but would you trust me? Right? Do you trust me as your comic book guy to recommend you this thing? And when people are going, no, man, I only trust these apps or these websites or these things, or when people say, oh, well, I don't like how that character is being portrayed, or how woke that thing is, or how Superman and Lois Lane aren't married anymore, it crushes you eventually. And so I think it's important to recognize, that while we may disagree with the ideas that someone like Glenn has put forward in this video, the things that are influencing that statement are impossible for him to not see, right? For him to ignore. So, I think Glenn has been bullied a little bit over this, especially in the retailer community and especially in certain places of the internet. And I don't think that's right. I don't think he's telling the God's honest truth. I don't think he's being completely authentic. I don't think he's being completely forthright. But at the same time, when you have somebody coming into your store saying one thing, it's easy just to agree with them because it helps you make more sales. And then eventually you start believing it yourself. So I think that's an important thing to take away from this.
Yeah. And I would, I think that's an important point. I'm glad you make that point because it is important to realize that I think we live in a world where everybody should be able to express their opinion. And while he's received that bullying too, and I think it's important to point out that that's not necessarily the right way to approach it. Attack the ideas. Attack the ideas if you have a problem with them, is what I would say. Don't attack the individual. However, I will also point out, and I think this is kind of the yin to the yang there, there's been a lot of rallying around what he said as well, too. And so I think that's why it made such a good topic for tonight's show. And hopefully people watching this either live or watching it on the rewind are leaving with some questions that they might have themselves in their own heads about this, and what can be done for anything you don't like. That instead of playing that blame game, like what could actually be done to improve the situation, and more importantly, how to have more intelligent or heartfelt conversations around topics like this, about things that we're passionate about and things that we don't necessarily like the direction where they've headed or how they are heading, because it is ultimately things like what we choose to purchase, how we choose to support things, and how we choose to engage with things in our communities that will make them either successful or unsuccessful. And there's a lot of people that are upset with the way things are. And I think that's something that needs to be kind of respected and thought about and kind of worked through together to move forward on how to enjoy comics more as a community. Hopefully, we do need pretty much everybody involved in comic books at this point to continue to be being involved with comic books, and hopefully some extra people too. Is kind of the way I look at the world anyway. So hopefully that's kind of part of the solution here, is everybody talks about it.
Absolutely. My big takeaway is that, or my big kind of leave you with this is that, everybody should be able to express their opinions, but before you parrot an opinion, make sure you know. Make sure you do some research. Make sure you pay attention. And if there's something you don't like the direction it's going, that's fine. But don't write it off before you see where it ends up.
Yeah.
I read a lot of comics.
How you put it out there.
Right. I read a lot of comics every week that I don't necessarily love, because my job is to read comics. I'm more often happy to see where they end up because it brings the story to fruition. Whatever, even if it's not for me, I need to wait and see where we're going. So don't write something off just because it's not what you thought it should be. Wait and see where it ends up. So make sure, don't be reactionary. Get some information and then form a response.
Yep, I agree.
All right. Should we tell them what we're talking about next week? Do we know what we're talking about next week?
So we the way that we're looking at this, by the way, we're kind of picking this out a week or two ahead, sometimes a little bit more. but we might pivot, if something comes up that we think is worth talking about. So if we ever tell you the topic and for example, Jay posted in chat earlier the link where you can go share your ideas for future episodes and discussion topics for the Devil's Advocates. Maybe one of your ideas is so good that we bump it to the top of the list. But right now, we are currently going to be trying to talk about a comic book pricing kind of experiment in a way. Next week, we're going to kind of look at pricing some different books and maybe different ways to price books correctly, kind of educate a little bit, or at least kind of shine some light on some different practices we use pricing books. Might kind of help people be a little bit more informed when they go out there to make purchase decisions and selling decisions. So kind of the idea is how to price comic books better. And then we're going to talk about that next week on next week's Devil's Advocates. Remember, we are at the new time slot. That is 7:30 p.m. Pacific, 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. If you want to come check us out, we'd love to see you come check us out, especially with any of your friends you want to bring along by sharing the show.
I want to address this real quick. Murdoch, don't buy a comic you don't like. Right? Don't buy a comic you don't like. But don't also say no one should buy that comic because you don't like it. Wait and see where it ends up. And if at the end of that comic, once you see where it ends up, it still needs to be said, don't buy it, then say that. If there's nothing redeeming about the comic at the end, then yeah, go ahead and say, don't buy it. But don't, because you don't like it, tell somebody else that they shouldn't. So. All right. That'll do it for today's Devil's Advocates. Tune in tomorrow for Minute Skim It with Jay, Jen, and I. Then Mint Hunter Comics at 8 p.m. Eastern. And then at 10 p.m. Eastern, Kicking It with Henri on its new night on Wednesdays. Or on Tuesdays. Then Wednesday, we have a full slate of shows. And remember, Thursday at 11 a.m., GM Comics here on The Experience. Brand new show. They will also be back Saturday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. So, for Bronze and Jay, who's backstage, thank you to everybody in the comments. Yes, trade Paper Dad. You can't always trade Wait a Book. I do it all the time. It's one of my favorite things to do now. Thank you for being here. We will see you all next week.
Join the party. Head over to our link tree to find all the links for everywhere The Experience is all the time.